To Quiso by Night, Chapter 5 of Shardik by Richard Adams, read by Celeste Lawrenson in September 2020. To Quiso by Night. Kelderek knelt in the bow, now peering into the speckled gloom ahead, now shutting his eyes and dropping his chin on his chest in a fresh spasm of fear. At his back, the enormous Ancre, Belcochazette's servant and bodyguard, sat silent as the canoe drifted with the current along the south bank of the Telferna. From time to time, Ancre's paddle would drop to arrest or change their course, and at the sound, Kelderek started as though the loud stir of the water were about to reveal them to enemies in the dark. Since giving the order to set out, Belcotrazette had said not a word, sitting hunched in the narrow stern, hands clasped about his knees. More than once, as the paddles fell, the swirl and seethe of bubbles alarmed some nearby creature, and Kelderek jerked his head towards the clatter of wings, the splash of a dive, or the crackle of undergrowth on the bank. Biting his lip and clutching at the side of the canoe, he tried to recall that these were nothing but birds and animals with which he was familiar, that by day he would recognize each one. Yet beyond these noises of flight he was listening always for another, more terrible sound, and dreading the second appearance of that animal to whom, as he believed, the miles of jungle and river presented no obstacle. And again, shrinking from this, his mind confronted dismally another lifelong fear, the fear of the island for which they were bound. Why had the Baron been summoned thither, and what had that summons to do with the news which he himself had refused to tell? They had already travelled a long way beneath the trees overhanging the water, when the servants evidently recognized some landmark. The left paddle dropped once more, and the canoe checked, turning towards the centre of the river. Upstream, a few faint lights on Ortelga were just visible, while to their right, far out in the darkness, there now appeared another light, high up, a flickering red glow that vanished and re-emerged as they moved on. The servants were working now, driving the canoe across the stream, while the current, flowing more strongly at this distance from the bank, carried them down. Kelderek could sense in those behind him a growing uneasiness. The paddler's rhythm became short and broken. The bow struck against something floating in the dark, and at the jolt Belcotrazette grunted sharply, like a man on edge. "My lord," said Ancre. "Be silent," replied Belcotrazette instantly. Like children in a dark room, like wayfarers passing a graveyard at night, the four men in the canoe filled the surrounding darkness with the fear from their own hearts. They were approaching the island of Quiso, domain of the Tuginda and the cult over which she ruled, a place where men retained no names, or so it was believed, weapons had no effect, and the greatest strength could spend itself in vain against incomprehensible power. On each fell a mounting sense of solitude and exposure. To Kelderek it seemed that he lay upon the black water helpless as the diaphanous guylon fly, whose fragile myriads clotted the surface of the river each spring, inert as a felled tree in the forest, as a log in the timber yard. All around them, in the night, stood the malignant, invisible woodmen, disintegrators armed with axe and fire. Now the log was burning, breaking up into sparks and ashes, drifting away beyond the familiar world of day and night, of hunger, work, and rest. The red light seemed close now, and as it drew nearer still and higher above them, he fell forward, striking his forehead against the bow. He felt no pain from the blow, and to himself he seemed to have become deaf, for he could no longer hear the lapping of the water. Bereft of perceptions, of will and identity, he knew himself to have become no more than the fragments of a man. He was no one, and yet he remained conscious. As though in obedience to a command, he closed his eyes. At the same moment the paddlers ceased their stroke, bowing their heads upon their arms, and the canoe, losing way entirely, drifted with the current towards the unseen island. Now into the remnants of Kelderek's mind began to return all that, since childhood, he had seen and learned of the Tuginda. Twice a year she came to Ortelga by water, the far-off gongs sounding through the mists of early morning, the people waiting silent on the shore. The men lay flat on their faces as she and her women were met and escorted to a new hut built for her coming. There were dances and a ceremony of flowers, but her real business was first to confer with the barons, and secondly, in a session secret to the women, to speak of their mysteries, and to select, from among those put forward, one or two to return with her to perpetual service on Quiso. At the end of the day, when she left in torchlight and darkness, the hut was burned, and the ashes scattered on the water. When she stepped ashore, she was veiled, but in speaking with the barons, she wore the mask of a bear. None knew the face of the Tuginda, or who she might once have been. The women chosen to go to her island never returned. It was believed that there they received new names. At all events, their old names were never spoken again in Ortelga. It was not known whether the Tuginda died or abdicated, who succeeded her, how her successor was chosen, or even, on each occasion of her visit, whether she was, in fact, the same woman as before. Once, when a boy, Kelderek had questioned his father with impatience, such as the young often feel for matters which they perceive that their elders regard seriously and discuss little. For reply, his father had moistened a lump of bread, moulded it to the rough shape of a man, and put it to stand on the edge of the fire. "Keep away from the women's mysteries, lad," he said, "and fear them in your heart, for they can consume you. Look, the bread dried, browned, blackened, and shriveled to a cinder. Do you understand?" Kelderek, silenced by his father's gravity, had nodded and said no more, but he had remembered. What had possessed him tonight in the room behind the Sindrad? What had prompted him to defy the High Baron? How had those words passed his lips, and why had not Belcotrazette killed him instantly? One thing he knew. Since he had seen the bear, he had not been his own master. At first he had thought himself driven by the power of God, but now chaos was his master. His mind and body were unseamed like an old garment, and whatever was left of himself lay in the power of the numinous, night-covered island. His head was still resting on the bow, and one arm trailed overside in the water. Behind him, the paddle dropped from Ancre's hands and drifted away. As the canoe grounded on the upstream shore, its occupants slumped where they sat, tranced and spell-stopped, not a will, not a mind intact. And thus they stayed, driftwood, flotsam and foam, while the quarter moon set far upstream, and darkness fell, broken only by the gleam of the fire still burning inland, high among the trees. Time passed, a time marked only by the turning of the stars. Small, choppy river waves chattered along the sides of the canoe, and once or twice, with a rising susurration, the night wind tossed the branches of the nearest trees, but never the least stir made the 4 men in the canoe, huddled in the dark like birds on a perch. At length a nearer, smaller light appeared, green and swaying, descending towards the water. As it reached the pebbly shore, there sounded a crunching of footsteps and a low murmur of voices. 2 cloaked women were approaching, carrying between them, on a pole, a round, flat lantern as big as a grindstone. The frame was of iron, and the spaces between the bars were panelled with plated rushes, translucent, yet stout enough to shield and protect the candles fixed within. The 2 women reached the edge of the water and stood listening. After a little they perceived in the dark the knock of the water against the canoe, a sound distinguishable only by ears familiar with every cadence of wind and wave along the shore. They set down the lantern then, and one, drawing out the pole from the ring, and splashing it back and forth in the shallows, called in a harsh voice, "Wake!" The sound came to Kelderek sharp as the cry of a moorhen. Looking up, he saw the wavering green light reflected in the splashed water inshore. He was no longer afraid. As the weaker of 2 dogs presses itself to the wall and remains motionless, knowing that in this lies its safety, so Kelderek, through total subjection to the power of the island, had lost his fear. He could hear the high barons stirring behind him. Belcotrazette muttered some inaudible words and dashed a handful of water across his face, yet made no move to wade inshore. Turning his head for a moment, Kelderek saw him staring, as though still bemused, towards the dimly shining turbulence in the shadows. The woman's voice called again, "Come!" Slowly, Belcotrazette climbed over the side of the canoe into the water, which reached scarcely to his knees, and waded towards the light. Kelderek followed, splashing clumsily through the slippery pools. Reaching the shore, he found confronting him a tall, cloaked woman, standing motionless, her face hidden in her cowl. He, too, stood still, not daring to question her silence. He heard the servants come ashore behind him, but the tall woman paid them no heed, only continuing to gaze at him as though to perceive the very beating of his heart. At last, or so he thought, she nodded, and thereupon at once turned about, stooped, and passed the pole through the iron ring on the lantern. Then she and her companion took it up between them, and began to walk away, unstumbling over the loose, yielding stones. Not a man moved until, when she had gone perhaps 10 paces, the tall woman, without turning her head, called, "Follow!" Kelderek obeyed, keeping his distance behind them like a servant. Soon they began to climb a steep path into the woods. He was forced to grope among the rocks for handholds, yet the women went up easily, one behind the other, the taller raising the pole above her head to keep the lantern level. Still they climbed, and still he followed breathlessly in the dark, until, the way growing less steep, and at last level, he thought that they could not be far below the very summit of the island. The trees grew thickly, and he could no longer see the light ahead. Groping among the ferns and drifts of leaves, he could hear, louder as he went on, the sound of cascading water, and suddenly found himself standing on the spur of rock overlooking a ravine. On the opposite side lay a stone-paved terrace, in the middle of which were the glowing embers of a fire. This, he felt sure, must be the source of that light, high up, which he had seen from the river, a beacon light to guide them. Beyond, a wall of rock rose into the dark, and this he could see plainly, for round the edges of the terrace stood 5 tripods, each supporting a bronze bowl from which rose translucent flames, yellow, green, and blue. There was little smoke, but the air was filled with a resinous sweet scent. More disturbing and awe-inspiring than the empty terrace with its basins of flame was the square opening cut in the rock wall behind. A carved pediment overhung it, supported by a pillar on either side, and to him it seemed that the black space between was gazing upon him inscrutably, like the unseen face of the cowled woman on the shore. Disturbed, he turned his eyes away, yet still, like a prisoner standing in a crowded court, felt himself watched, and, looking back once more, saw again only the flame-lit terrace and the opening beyond. He stared downwards into the ravine. A little to his right, scarcely visible in the flickering darkness, he could make out a waterfall, not sheer, but cascading steeply over rocks until lost in the deep cleft below. In front of this, close to the falling water and gleaming wet with spray, a felled tree trunk, no thicker than a man's thigh, spanned the ravine from bank to bank. The upper side had been roughly planed, and upon this, with no handrail, the 2 women were now crossing as easily as they had walked over the shore. The pliant trunk sprang beneath their weight, and the lantern tossed upon its pole, yet they moved with an unhurried grace, like village girls at evening, carrying their pitchers from the well. Slowly Kelderek descended from the spur. Coming to the nearer end of the bridge, he began, fearfully, to put one foot before the other. The cascade at his elbow showered him with its cold spray. The invisible water below sent up its echoes about him, and after a few steps he crouched upon his knees, fumbling one-handed along the undulating tree trunk. He dared not raise his eyes to look ahead. Staring down at his own hand, he could see, besides, nothing but the grain of the wood, knot after knot coming into his circle of vision and disappearing under his chin as he edged forward. Twice he stopped, panting and digging his nails into the curved underside as the trunk swayed up and down. When at last he reached the further end, he continued groping blindly along the ground on his hands and knees, until by chance he caught and crushed a handful of creeping locatalanga, and with that pungent scent about him, came to himself and realized that he was no longer clutching and tossing above the water. He stood up. Ahead, the women were crossing the center of the terrace, one behind the other as before. Watching, he saw them reach the edge of the heap of embers within their fleece of ash. Without a pause, they stepped into it, lifting the hems of their cloaks exactly as though waiting a ford. As the hindmost raised her hem, he glimpsed for a moment her bare feet. Ash and sparks rose in a fine dust, as chaff rises about the feet of a miller. Then they were pacing on beyond, leaving behind them an exposed, dull-red track across the circle of the dying fire. Keldrek, moaning, sank to the ground and buried his face in the crook of his arm. This, then, was the manner of his coming to the upper temple upon Quiso of the Ledges, this bringer of the tidings that generations had awaited but never heard, injured, drenched, grovelling, and half hysterical, shutting out what lay before his eyes, determined, strange determination, only upon the surrender of whatever shreds of willpower the island had left him. When at length the High Baron and his servants came to the edge of the ravine, and in their turn tottered like cripples along the leaping tree, they found him lying prone on the edge of the terrace, cackling and gasping with a sound more dreadful than the laughter of the deaf and dumb.